Back in the Shadows. A novel written by Andy Jones and narrated by Andy Jones. Chapter 1. The first attempt on my life since I retired happened just 1 week after my 71st birthday. I hadn't done much to celebrate my 71st. Bought myself a new TV to replace the one that stopped working 2 days before. Got a fancier-than-usual microwave meal for one that night. A week later, and I'd almost forgotten about my birthday until I got a text message from my old friend, Len Hawkins. I hadn't seen Len for years. We'd message each other occasionally, just to touch base. He was older than me and had been retired for longer. Hawkins had a large family that seemed to keep him busy. Each year it was like a new grandchild appeared, but he always sounded happy. I was glad for him that he'd found peace in retirement. I had ordered tea in Young's, an independent seaside cafe in Shoreham-by-Sea. It's where I lived. Far enough away from Bournemouth not to feel like a retirement village, and far enough away from Brighton to escape the noise. It was quiet, aside from the wind, and I liked that. It's what I had always wanted at this time in my life. I liked Young's. It was run by an East European kid. I didn't know his name, but he was always friendly, and it got to the point where I didn't need to order anymore. I would just show up, sit at one of the plastic tables by the window, and he'd walk across with a mug of tea. The tea wasn't too weak, wasn't too strong. Just right. And in a proper mug, no faffing with pots. The wind had been particularly bracing that morning, and I had contemplated not leaving my flat at all. I had nowhere to go and nothing to do. That was typical, but I liked to get out anyway, even if it was just to take in a little air. But it was so damn cold that day that halfway to the cafe I nearly considered going back. I kept going. It was only a 5-minute walk at the best of times, and I'd convinced myself it was good for me. There was a private gym on Shoreham Beach that I visited at least 4 times a week to keep myself in shape. It was just something I did out of habit. I could never be off point at work. And even in retirement, I hated losing that sense of alertness. I knew it was going to happen as I got older, but working out seemed to slow that drift down. It was different for Len Hawkins, whose cohort of grandchildren seemed to be keeping him young and energetic, even if he was... Goodness, he must have been in his 80s by now. My mug of tea was still just a little too hot when Hawkins texted me. "Belated birthday for last week," he started. "Sorry for not messaging sooner. A few things have been keeping me preoccupied. Haven't seen you for ages, old man. Must catch up soon. Len." I decided not to reply right away. I'd do it after I faced the October seaside wind and walked back to my flat. I tentatively tasted the tea. It had cooled just a little bit. There were 5 other customers in the cafe that morning. 2 elderly couples and 1 elderly man sitting alone like me. Usual crowd for Young's. The bright sun coming from the glass door of the cafe vanished for the briefest of seconds as it opened. A man I'd never seen before walked in. He had short brown hair, clipped, military style, and a bushy brown beard like young people have these days. His black jeans, white shirt, and leather jacket all looked pristine. He was looking for someone. He walked right past me at pace, looking at every other table before turning back. I glanced to my right and, because of the sun, could see his reflection walking towards me. He wasn't looking around the room anymore. He was direct now, purposeful. and he held a knife. I forced myself to keep looking at the window and only turned to face him at the last second. Using the window's reflection as a guide, I grabbed his right arm and pulled the knife across the table. He wasn't expecting it and lurched forward. He resisted, landing across the table, and quickly tried to twist the knife towards me. That was the signal I needed. This wasn't a mistake or a misreading of the situation. He was going to try and stab me. My movements were just reflexes, muscle memory. With my free left arm, I planted an elbow in his face. He howled and fell back. I lost the grip of his right arm, and he went clattering to the ground, taking my plastic table and mug of tea with him. It was only at this second that the 5 other patrons in the cafe saw that something was wrong. They didn't know what, but I did. I stood and cracked him hard in the face with my left foot, wishing I was in my heavier and more substantial boots. He didn't call out this time, but didn't stay down either. He clambered up quickly, and I realized right away he was at least 6'3", if not more. He was wide, with muscles just visible under his white shirt. The shirt wasn't as pristine anymore, with blood from his nose now smearing it. He didn't wipe it, though. He still had the knife. I had hit him hard, but he was unaffected. I knew he only had to get one hit or lunge in, and I was finished. We had both managed to take a moment. We were both ready. I couldn't run. His arms were long, and that knife would stick me before I could leap to the door. And then, who else would die in that place after me? I waited a second longer. Just see what he was going to do, then try and counter it. Maybe use his own weight and size against him. He lunged forward and moved in close to give me nowhere to go. I leant back against my metal-framed chair, but slipped to the side. For the briefest of moments, he was off balance. I kicked his right shin hard. It probably hurt me more than him, but it did the job. He moved further forward towards the glass window, and I helped the momentum along by shoving him. His face cracked hard against the glass, and he slipped on the tea from my mug that had already smashed onto the tile floor. He turned quickly on his back, still with that damned knife in his hand. His first lunge missed me, and I saw him drive down to try and stick it in my leg. In one move, I pulled my metal-framed chair across the floor, whacking his right arm with it as hard as I could. I just about heard the audible gasps from the elderly customers behind me. Again, my move had jarred my hands harder than it had hurt his arm, but at least he dropped the knife, which glided on the floor and hit the far wall. I smacked the chair down hard on his face. Once, twice. The third time it snapped, with the frame falling in two. He cried out in pain, blood now pouring from the cut on his face after it had smacked into the window. Battering him with a chair had turned it into a gaping wound. Blood left him blinded in one eye, but he was still dangerous. He punched his left fist in the air, missing my stomach area by an inch at most. Despite the damage I'd already done to him, I knew that if his punch had connected, that would have been it for me. I took one of the metal chair legs and pounded the end of it against his skull again and again. And once more, though he had stopped moving. His blood on my hands, I dropped the chair leg, or what was left of it, and slumped down on the table next to mine. The rest of the room came back into vision. It was like the instinct for survival, my sudden focus, could now fade, and I was back in the world. My heart was pounding. My legs were shaking. Placed them against the table, gripping tight to stop them. I felt an intense pain from my left elbow, from when I first connected with him. Pain in all sorts of places now. As I came back into the room, the feeling was coming back to my body. A woman screamed, "What have you done?" Her husband quietened her down right away. I turned to look at them all. They'd moved into the far corner. All 5 of them. Plus the Eastern European kid, who always knew to get me a cup of tea. He wasn't smiling now. None of them were. I knew that look. I had seen it plenty of times before. They were afraid of me. The bright October sunshine had turned to a dullness, and it was only just turned 4 o'clock. The blue flashing police light was illuminating the crack in the glass on the front of the cafe window. I was in the back of the police car, an Astra. Locked doors. A young officer was sitting in the front passenger seat directly in front of me. She had a gaunt face. Could only have been mid-20s. She hadn't spoken a word to me. When her partner put me in the back, she had a look of fear. She didn't want to be left in the car with me. Not after what I'd done. I understood that. The body of the man I killed was still lying face up on the cafe tiles. There was a white cloth over the bearded assailant's crushed face. Other officers were taking pictures. A 30-something male detective in a dark grey suit and a horrible cologne had talked to me briefly before reading me my rights and handing me off to the uniformed officers. He had then talked to the others in the cafe. I could see them talking breathlessly. The old lady who had screamed before was getting upset and crying. She pointed at me. The old guy, who I guessed was her husband, was comforting her. They had no problems looking at me now. The police were here. They weren't afraid anymore. The grey-suited detective had checked the pockets of the man I killed and found nothing. I had already done that. I checked the pockets myself before the police showed up. I had recomposed myself enough after the fight to tell the scared patrons not to worry, that I wasn't going to hurt them and to call the police. I was speaking as softly as I could, but the gruffness of my voice even surprised me. I guess it was a combination of what had just happened and the fact that I hadn't spoken to anyone all day at that point. The Eastern European kid was the first to be brave enough to move away from the huddle and call 999. He spoke to them in soft tones, and I couldn't hear what he was saying. But I noticed he didn't keep his eyes off me for a second. I knelt down and checked the dead man's pockets. Nothing in the jacket and nothing in the jeans. For him to have nothing on him at all, except that knife, told me plenty. But for the boys in blue, they'd have a tough time working out what that meant. It was nearly 5 o'clock when the grey-suited detective walked over to the police car. He gestured to the female officer in the car with me to wind down the window. She started to wind down hers until she saw he was pointing at me. "Sorry," she said, pressing the button to bring my window down a notch. Yeah, fear still in her voice. It had started to rain. Just a little drizzle. The detective leant down to my eye level. I caught that cologne again. He held up a transparent plastic bag with the knife sealed inside. "So this is yours," he said. "No," I said. "It's not mine. He came in with it, like I told you." "And he had nothing else on him, just a knife?" "Yes." "And you say you don't know who he is?" "Right." "You really expect us to believe that?" I just leaned back in my seat. What was the point in carrying the conversation on? The grey-suited detective told a uniformed male police officer to take me back to the station. He got into the driver's seat, much to the relief of the female officer, and we drove off. It was about 2 hours later before they even properly spoke to me. I was wearing slip-on shoes, so thankfully they didn't have to take my laces away. They took away my belt, though, and my mobile phone, house keys and wallet. It was all I had on me. They let me keep my long light brown jacket, though. It was keeping me warm in the holding cell. By the time the detective in the grey suit saw me again, the rain outside was coming down much harder. He'd been out in it, and thankfully it had washed away most of the stink from his cologne. He introduced himself, and right away I forgot what he said. Who cares? He wasn't going to be important. That much I was sure of. The interrogation room consisted of 4 off-white walls with a single dark green line running across the middle. There was a window about 7 feet up that was big enough to see the raindrops hitting it, but small enough not to see the outside world properly. 3 fluorescent light strips ran along the top of the ceiling. There was a metal table and 2 metal chairs. I noticed that the table and my chair were screwed into the floor. The door was solid and metal, just like the holding cells, with a little viewing hatch and a buzzer at the top for people to press from the outside. The whole room must have been about 8 feet by 8 feet at the most. The detective pressed a button on a plastic recording device on the table that flashed a red light at him. 2 wires, one was the plug and the other obviously connected this device to something else, ran from the desk along the floor to a hole in a far corner of the wall. It was taped down with yellow and black duct tape. Health and safety. Into the recording device, he stated his name and the time and declared he was interviewing Mr. Harry Grant, 71, from flat 418, Coral House, Shoreham Beach, Sussex. He then sat down and looked at me. Neither of us spoke for almost a minute. Mr. Grant, he eventually said, do you understand the rights you were read when we arrested you? I nodded. For the tape, Mr. Grant? Yes. And you understand that we've arrested you on suspicion of murder? Yes. And once again, for the record, you've refused to have a lawyer present at this interview, although it is your right to have one? Yes. Okay then. He leaned back in his chair, thought about things for a moment. Mr. Grant, what were you doing in the Young's Cafe today? Drinking tea. And? And nothing else, I said. But what were you doing at exactly the moment this man you killed walked in the room? I paused for a second and said, I was waiting. Waiting for what, Mr. Grant? Waiting for my tea to cool. He smirked. Wasn't quite sure what to make of me yet. I was certain I'd continue to be a mystery to him. Other people would insist. All right, he said. Tell me what you know about this gentleman we found dead on the floor at Young's. I told you everything I know about him when we were there, I said. But tell me again for the record. He's about 6'3", has a beard, came at me with a knife with the intent to kill me, and is now dead. That's all I know about him. You said he came at you with a knife with the intent to kill you. How did you know he was trying to kill you, Mr. Grant? I looked at the detective like he was an idiot. You mean rather than just a bit of light stabbing? And so we're clear, that's really your story. I nodded. Please, for the tape, he said. Yes, that's what happened. You're aware that we have CCTV in the cafe, and it was recording at the time of the attack. And it'll support everything I said. Have you seen it yet? I asked. Well, no, said the detective, a little unsure of himself all of a sudden. Not yet, but we've had it brought over here and my colleagues will be watching it momentarily. I'm not sure they'll have much of a chance, Detective, I said, leaning back in my seat. What do you mean? It's the problem with the pool you're swimming in, I said. There's about to be a bigger fish. He went to ask me something else, but the buzzer on the door went off. And there it is, I said. He looked at me confused for a moment. The buzzer went off again. Just a second, he said. He walked to the door and opened it slightly. He was having a hushed conversation with another police officer. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but I could guess pretty well. The other officer would be more senior. He would be telling the detective in the grey suit that they must do what they were told, that orders were orders, that they can't do anything about it. The grey-suited detective was answering back. He'd be frustrated. He wouldn't understand what was going on. Now, he would be told something about national security, pay grades, and to deal with it. After a second, I heard the detective in the grey suit say, "Okay," and he slammed the door shut behind him. I sat there in my chair, just like I had been told, alone in the 8-foot by 8-foot room. The tape recorder was still running. After a minute, I leaned forward towards the microphone and said, "I'm sorry, but this was always going to happen like this." They wouldn't ever fully understand it, but maybe it'd make the grey-suited detective feel better later. After another 3 or 4 minutes, the metal door opened with a thud. 2 people walked in and closed the door behind them. Here we go, I thought. It was a man and a woman. The man wore round glasses and was slim. He looked maybe 50, but could have been older. His hair was cut very short to disguise the fact that it was thinning, but the front had receded so much that he was fooling nobody. The woman was younger, maybe mid-30s. She was pretty. Pale skin, but dark features. Her black hair was wavy, but I couldn't tell if it just looked like that naturally or if she styled it that way. She was petite too. Couldn't be more than 5'2", if that. They looked at me for a good 30 seconds. I looked back. I still had blood on my hands and face. I gestured to the recorder. They could see the red light flashing. The petite woman turned it off after a few moments of working out what button to press. The man showed me his identification. It was an ID I knew well. I used to have one. Military Intelligence, Section 5. "My name is Nick Gorman, and this is Mary Silver," he said. I nodded. "Mr. Grant, we're going to take you to London now. MI5 is taking this investigation over." "Of course," I said, standing up. "Right this way, Mr. Grant," said Mary Silver. I said, "What took you people so long?"